Welcome to the second Aragon Meetup at BlueYard. I think the first meetup happened almost exactly a year ago. It was exactly a year ago.
365 days ago.
Good planning.
That was not planned. I think Chris is going to say a few words to Livepeer, who kindly agreed to live stream today's event. And then Brett will do the presentation in Aragon. And then I think it's probably going to take like 40 minutes?
Yeah.
More or less. I mean, a little flexible. Q&A whenever you want. And then there's still maybe some pizza left, drinks here. Enjoy.
Cool. Thank you, Philip, for hosting us. You always do such a wonderful job of hosting the blockchain community in Berlin. So thank you. Big round of applause for Philip. Always so positive and passionate. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about Livepeer before Brett talks about Aragon. So first of all, show of hands, who's ever watched a live stream on the internet? Okay, and keep your hand up if it was on YouTube or Facebook. Right, okay. So let me tell you a little story about two guys, Doug Petcanics, Eric Tang. 18 months ago, they kicked off the Livepeer project. 6 months later, so around about March, April last year, they published the white paper for a decentralized open source live streaming protocol running on Ethereum. We spent the last summer building test version, internal testnet, before deploying out to Rinkeby in December, January time. Went through security audit, and about 5 weeks ago, finally launched this thing to Ethereum mainnet with real money, real tokens, created 10 million tokens, and we're actually live streaming on the system that we created tonight. If you go to livepeer.tv, hopefully it should be working. It normally does, so this, this is the positive thing. So a little bit about when we launched to the mainnet, we created 10 million tokens. And after we kind of taken some for core team and for early contributors, we still had about 63% of our tokens left. So this we have spread across the entire, pretty much the entire Ethereum community. So if you had more than 0.1 Ethereum at a block height in the middle of March, then you're entitled to a share of the Livepeer project. If you want to find out more about how that works and how you can claim you're part of this madness or anything more about the Livepeer project in general, then feel free to come and talk to me after. But you're all here to see this guy talk, so I'm going to kind of hand over now to Brett. We just need to switch the microphones across.
Do you have a clicker by any chance, or no?
I don't have a clicker for your laptop. No, sorry.
That's good.
Okay. And let's try and put this in a place where it works. Okay, let's see how that works.
Test.
Okay.
All good? Test, it's good? All good? All right, perfect. I'm just gonna, if I can move this over a little bit, get it easier to reach. Cool, so thank you all for coming here. I think as we were talking, the presentation, it's gonna be more maybe of an update of where Aragon has been and where it is now. Aragon has a very similar timeline to Livepeer. I think both of our projects had a very similar development cycle. About 18 months ago, it was started, and then about 4 or 5 months after that, there was a white paper release, and then we eventually ICO'd in May of 2017. A special thanks to Philip and BlueYard as well, because as we were talking, it was literally 365 days ago that the first Aragon meetup ever in the world was physically made. And so we're back again this year to kind of give an update and where we've been. I can talk a lot about development, and so I'd like to open it up afterwards if there's a lot of developers or if people are interested in kind of the tech stack that we have to kind of go into more detail about that. I don't want to kind of take all of the time to talk about that if no one's really interested, but I'd hope to dive down more on that if anyone does want to, once I give kind of a high-level overview of where we are. So I want to introduce, first of all, a character, a profile that we think a lot about at Aragon, and this is Maria. This is a person who, when she was young, she wanted to start a company. She was very very interested in being an entrepreneur. This is her in her happiest moment when she was young. She's just at a festival. She's just enjoying the summer like we all are. And she feels free. She feels like she's able to do anything. She's able to realize her dreams. But the unfortunate reality is that there's people in our government that don't really want that to happen. They kind of want to keep all the fun to themselves. They like to use coercion, violence, other means to crack down on people like Maria that they don't necessarily like coming out. They also don't really use the best tactics to make sure this happens. They try to use, let's say, programs to control her thoughts, to control what she's doing, and to make sure that she's following them. Otherwise, the slide before happens. And a lot of that is kind of where Aragon came into existence. When it was first started, it was actually interesting because it was started right after Donald Trump got elected. And it was when the co-founders, Luis and Jorge, decided that, hey, look, maybe this whole thing of governance is like kind of a tricky topic, and maybe this is not where the world should be going. And so that's why they started thinking about what it might mean to have a jurisdiction without borders, without physical implications. What does it mean for jurisdiction to be digital? And that's where Aragon and the Aragon network were born. How do we put organizations and human creativity in a digital manner and kind of use that collectively on the internet or on other digital systems and effectively govern those outputs? And so, as I was saying, it's a project to empower freedom by giving people the ability to govern themselves and to collaborate with each other. So at the drawing board about 18 months ago, it was pretty much these three. It was Luis on the right, Jorge on the top, and the person who designed the logo, Adri, on the bottom left. And they were looking at the world's first DAO. They were looking at Bitcoin. And this, Bitcoin works. Bitcoin does its job very well. It stores accounts very well. It's very difficult to break, let's say. But it's also very limited in what it can do. If you try to ever build something on Bitcoin, it's not necessarily the most fun experience. It takes a lot of effort, and it's not really meant to be used for anything other than storing accounts of value. And then we had the DAO on Ethereum, and that happened. Glad that's over. And then Jorge and Luis started thinking about Aragon, and they released this white paper about what it might mean for a digital jurisdiction about a year ago. And they created the first versions of Aragon that allowed someone to create an organization, essentially be their own bank on the internet. And this was a really compelling use case for a lot of people. Along with that, we raised money. We created A&T kind of to bootstrap the community, to get the community thinking about how these organizations might work, and to effectively, at a later point, launch the network and use A&T to govern the network. And then let's fast forward now, about a year later, we have a new white paper that was just released, I think, 2 or 3 weeks ago. It's kind of rethought a lot of the specifics about what the Aragon network might do. In the year since, we've had a lot of informal discussions. We've had a lot of back and forth about how certain things might work. Of course, as with everything, because it's super young, our thinking has changed completely about a number of topics. And please check this out for the latest vision of what this network might look like, what a digital jurisdiction might look like. It has a few it's in the same spirit, let's say. I went through the white paper, the old white paper today, and the new white paper, and was kind of looking at where these things have differed and where they're very similar. And for most of the parts, like all of the things that we're starting to talk about in this new version of the white paper, it's a lot shorter and it's a lot more concise. But a lot of it, if you try to look at the old white paper, it's like, oh, this was kind of brought up, but it was kind of like in passing, or it was just kind of like, we're going to do this. And it was kind of an open question mark as to how we were going to do that. And now the second attempt is more of a first step at saying, here are our first initial thoughts about what this actual jurisdiction will look like and how we're going to build it and how we're going to govern it. Along with this second white paper, we're starting to think about A&T not just as a governance token, but also as an economic token as a unit of value, storage of account and unit of value. And so we want it to be used by people to collateralize their agreements between each other. So if an organization wants to go into business with another organization, they have to collateralize ANT or another token to underline their business together, so that there's a form of mitigation of risk between these two parties. And we hope to make ANT the world's best currency for economic development, because it'll have certain properties afterwards. It'll be optimized for certain properties that make it very, let's say it'll make it the best choice for someone to collateralize their agreements with on the Aragon network. There's a lot more about this in the second white paper, and I encourage you to check it out. I can't answer all the questions because I'm not day-to-day familiar with the specifics. I can kind of answer at a high level, but the best place would be that white paper. And so with all of this Aragon network, we're promising to come soon. We can't promise a date. We can't say anything because we're really bad with dates. So all we're saying is we're starting to think about this at a very, let's say we're starting to put a lot more resources into actually doing this, because we have the foundation now built ready for this jurisdiction to actually happen. And along with that, we've launched our research forum, where a lot of these topics are being talked about. A lot of these different back and forth conversations are now in the public, so that we can iterate with the general public on what this white paper is going to look like and what perhaps the parameters or other aspects that we're starting to talk about in this white paper might look like when we go about implementing it. And then this is kind of the fun bit where I get to talk about development and the stuff that we've done, the foundation work that we've done in the last year to make this network happen. And so at the start of the year, we launched Aragon OS 3.0. And Aragon OS is our framework about thinking about governance. The tagline is the framework for programming governance. And we view this operating system very similar to how a traditional operating system manages hardware. So a traditional operating system has resources. It has RAM, it has GPU, it has CPU, storage space, etc. And it lets people and apps on top of, provides an abstraction and lets people on top of that abstraction use those resources. And Aragon OS is very much the same concept, but applied for smart contracts, money, and human resources. So it effectively allows people to govern what resources are being used by what programs and by what humans. And if we think about organizations, it's really organizations have two forms of resources. They have capital, monetary capital, and they have human capital. And that's where the operating system kind of comes in. We're starting a few audits. We've completed one. This is kind of our interim, or this is pretty much our final report. I'll put in bold here that it is without question one of the most advanced smart contract frameworks in this space. And the one thing that they said when they were talking to us about it was that generally people want, auditees want the auditors to say that the system that the auditees have implemented is completely safe. But the White Hat group, they said, well, because of all the generality, because of the nature of the framework, it's impossible for us to say that it's secure. We can only say that a user is able to create secure systems, but if they want to, they can do anything they want with the system. And an implementation of this might look like allowing anybody in the world to access your organization's funds. That probably isn't what you want, but you can create those systems. It's arbitrary to that level where anybody might be able to access those funds. Along with that, I have to say that the White Hat group, if you don't know about them, they were the ones who were battling the hacker, the DAO hacker. So on one level, they were helping defeat the DAO hacker, and on another level, they're auditing the most advanced system to create DAOs. So they're very aligned with us as well in this endeavor. After that, after all of these smart contracts, we have a UI app. This is kind of the evolution of that first version that was released last year. It took us about a year to kind of go through everything and rethink all the concepts. Because the initial 0.1 version that hopefully some of you have played with was very narrow. It was very structured in a form that it looked at what companies and organizations before had needed. It needed a vault, it needed some sort of governance mechanism, it needed a way to include people inside this organization, but it didn't allow very much flexibility. It didn't allow generality. And so in the last year, we kind of spent a lot of it redesigning what that looks like and allowing people to create the most extensible systems that they want for their organizations. And so right now, this new app, we basically included with it 3 really simple apps called the Token Manager, the Voting app, and the Finance app. But the goal is to have anybody in the world contribute applications that they want to see on their own organization to allow them to create arbitrary structures for their organization. Whether that means, for example, having some sort of time lock for, instead of a multi-sig lock, you might have a time lock where it means only person A is able to transfer funds out if nobody rejects that decision after 5 days. You can build things like that that we haven't included and hook them up arbitrarily into the system to control your organization. And really, a lot of the thinking around this new release was about unstoppable organizations and how do we get to the cases like Maria, where maybe there's a bad actor, maybe there's people that are trying to censor an organization, or even without, you have the fallback. You know that you can't be censored if you use this technology. And so a lot of what we've done in 0.5 was make it completely decentralized to the point where we're loading front-end files from IPFS. All of the contract storage is obviously in the Ethereum virtual machine, and that anybody in the world, if they wanted to, they could spin up their own, essentially front end and access the EVM so that they can control their organization without relying on a different party. This is kind of what it looks like if you haven't seen it. We've tried as well to make it extremely user-friendly so that people can kind of go in and manage the organization as if it was just a normal app made for them and not for programmers, like a few other applications out there. And this is where kind of the deep dive goes into, and we can get into specifics if anybody is interested. So we're starting to talk about the generality, and this is how we achieve that generality, by allowing other people to run their own programmed applications, essentially, on top of the Aragon framework. And so essentially what happens is we have a layer at the very bottom here at the Ethereum virtual machine where people can create their own contracts and create their own applications based on that contract. Above that, we have kind of, we have what we call a wrapper, which is essentially the server that's running, like the front-end server that's running the shell of all the apps. So you'll see here on the left-hand side, this part is part of the wrapper. It's part of this native context in the browser. And the right-hand side is the one that application programmers, external people can start to play with the sandbox. And the right-hand side is that sandbox that I was talking about, where people can define their own UIs on top of their contract and define their own logic on top of that contract so that they can hook in their own application into an organization that has other applications installed from other parties. And the difficulty with this was in all the sandboxing that we need on the front end, on the client side, to make sure that there's no security vulnerabilities. Because, for example, if we give people access to Web3, they can do really, really dangerous stuff, like change which node you're talking to, and then all of a sudden, if you install an application, that changes the node you're talking to, and all of a sudden, that node is reporting wrong values when you try to send a transaction. You can start to see where these things become very insecure and get people scared. So we tried to the best of our ability to sandbox these different applications away. We haven't done a front-end audit yet, but we're reading the specs and whatnot, fairly sure that people don't have access to anything that can ruin other people's experiences if they're running an organization and they just install some arbitrary application. In the middle here, we have this middleware layer that I was talking about. This handles all of our communication back and forth between external applications and the native application. And as well, we built a UI toolkit to make it easy for anybody to get the same look. It's a blockchain native UI framework to let people pick and choose so that very quickly, if you want to build a UI on top to integrate it with Aragon, you'll have those components. As well, in just 2 weeks ago, we made an announcement that we have contracts on mainnet. We launched our survey application on mainnet using that entire same stack. And this first application for us is along the same path that we've always been trying to push for, and that's open, public discussions for governance. And this first app basically lets people vote with A&T about topics that we've kind of preceded. You'll see, for example, this example here. Would you like to participate in the, oops, I forgot to change this. No.
You've got to do 15
I got to do 15 squats? I'll do them at the end. Sorry about that, guys. Thankfully, it wasn't anything more embarrassing. Okay, so yeah, you'll see at the bottom here, without the squats, that we're asking, would you like to participate in the decision-making of DAOs? And anybody with A&T can go on it right now and say, yes, no, maybe, sometime, whatever. But of course, there'll be more important decisions, like we recently published a manifesto that says, these are our values going forward, and this is what we'd like to build the network with. And then we ask people, hey, as the token holders, do you agree with these values? And if we get a strong signal no, that puts the onus on us to say, hey, how do we make a better manifesto that fits with the people who are invested inside our ecosystem? As well, we published hack.aragon.1. This is kind of the developer resources anybody needs to kind of get started building an Aragon application that we were talking about. It has it has one tutorial, hopefully more coming soon, and all of the documentation about the whole stack. As part of this, we launched a CLI as well, a much more robust CLI than the one we had previously that has a whole bunch of functionality involved to let people easily test their own applications with a sandbox DAO, deploy their own applications, and kind of start to look at what their organization holds. In the future, there's going to be a little bit more to this. Right now, we have a lot of, basically, it's like a version 1 cut. Basically what anybody needs to publish to Aragon. But in the future, there'll be more kind of managerial tools involved where people can control their organization through the CLI as well if they really want to. And then something else that we have as well is the Aragon package manager that we're starting to think about what the future might hold. But essentially, when we were looking at package managers, we realized that these external applications that people might create, they need a place to live. They need a place to version themselves. Because versioning without governance is just broken. And governance without versioning is just very brittle. Because you can't change things as you go. And so this package manager is kind of our first attempt at getting people to create code repositories with arbitrary governance. And so it's really useful for things like smart contracts outside of Aragon as well, where you can say, the initial version of my contract lives at this address, and now the next version lives at this address. And people can pick and choose. They can then say, hey, look, I want to build off of this first version. This is where the address is. And you can apply arbitrary governance on this, where only certain people might have access to upgrade a version. Only people inside an organization. Only people inside a whitelist. Only people inside a TCR, things like that. And then you can start to kind of build and build and build and really make arbitrary governance decisions about who gets to deploy code and where this code lives. It's also useful for things like websites, if you want to version websites, Docker repos, et cetera. And it's really a big part in terms of upgradability. Like when you start to say, I want to upgrade a contract or upgrade some software, what does that mean? And how do people know that you're doing that legitimately? Now, this is kind of to bring it all back at a higher level where we talk about kind of where the Aragon organization is as well in the physical sense. So Aragon, when we first started, we were an Estonian foundation. And we were just having, well, the foundation right now contracts employees to work on it. But right now, we've realized with all of the things that we're pushing out and the vision that we have, just one team, just a team of 13 people is not enough to make everything, to make this thing a reality. And so we're starting to think about how to get other teams working on the same project and how to start funding them through our foundation. And with that, a few weeks ago, we announced that the foundation and the first development team are splitting off. And so this will be the first, this is like the 0 to 1 of what we want to accomplish with decentralizing implementation. So Aragon 1 will be a for-profit company that gets foundation funds through hopefully some governance in the future to build on top of Aragon and to further the vision. But as well, going from that, we want to start getting other teams on board, start to get other teams in the same model where the foundation then grants them money to build on the same values that the Aragon project has always had and will continue to have. Our community right now is quite strong. We have almost 10,000 community members from about a month ago. We have quite a lot of token holders, and we have quite a lot of Twitter followers. We also have a few initiatives called Aragon. Well, one of them is Aragon Labs, and this is our research branch, essentially, where we're working with a few other token native projects to find out what they need for governance, because they've either told us or they've specified to the public. They have an open promise to the public that they want to open up their governance to be decentralized as well. And as well, we have Aragon Nest, which was probably one of the first grants programs in this space, and is what I would consider one of the most robust and transparent, where we give teams working on infrastructure and really core foundational infrastructure in this ecosystem to give them money between, I think it's like anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000. I think it's in euros right now. And within like a 6 to 12 month timeline based on like their proposals and whether or not it fits with some of our high level vision as well. So please come hang out. We're on GitHub, we're on Rocket Chat as well. And then we also have our website to learn more, and hopefully that'll provide the root branch to kind of start digging in more and more into it. This is our team from about 4 months ago. We have, I think this is with a few advisors as well. And this is a slightly updated or slightly outdated version of our team. We're completely distributed. I think the most people we have in any given city is 2 right now. And there's a few places where that is. But as well, of course, this is very Western Hemisphere kind of related. So we'd like to get a few more. I mean, obviously Berlin is in the Western Hemisphere, but in case anybody on the live stream is watching from like China or India or Russia and the Siberia parts is interested, we are hiring. We're looking a lot for UI developers. Also for developer relations, we need to kind of build a lot of tooling, as we were talking about. A lot of what will make Aragon successful will be an open source movement. It's not just going to be on us, but it's going to be getting everybody in the world to kind of collaborate with us to make this a really successful project. And so please visit wiki.aragon.1/jobs for more information. And if you haven't seen the video, I think some of you have based on the response from the first slides. Please check it out. It's a great motivational video of why we're so interested in this project and kind of what keeps us going day to day. I can play it because I have a lot of time, and you are stuck with me.
So you asked me if there's going to be a revolution. I think there's already a revolution happening. We're seeing it everywhere.
Honestly, I feel like blockchain is almost slipping through the cracks. They don't even see that we're a threat yet. If you have a decentralized entity that people can opt into, that starts performing services that the government used to provide, then what do you need these guys for? Bitcoin is the first real experiment in DAOs. It's the first DAO that ever existed.
What's a DAO? I mean, decentralized autonomous organization is what it stands for, right?
Basically, a decentralized autonomous organization is an organization in which you can interact with it without having to go through an intermediary.
I think that's very important for us to have tools that are really censorship resistant.
We have evolved so much as a society, but yet our governance structures are hundreds of years old.
We had a long period of monarchies, right? And that was a very centralized form of governance. And we had a great evolution with democracies, right? Spreading that power a bit more. Now, I would argue that corporations are superseding nation states in terms of their power.
You're a digital serf right now, living on Facebook. You work the land, you work the feed, and they take all the benefit. They take all of the value, right? It's a free service where you are the product.
Systems tend to perpetuate themselves. In other words, capitalism tends to do what's best for the market, maybe not what is best for all the individuals who comprise the market.
Silicon Valley, they tend to fund projects or companies that are trying to solve very much first world problems. How do you get your food 5 minutes quicker? How do you get your Uber 2 minutes faster? Whereas with blockchain technology, we have the ability to fund initiatives that will produce true social good and provide value to the most undervalued parts of humanity.
This is the most egalitarian way to construct systems.
The culture is moving faster than the nation state can handle, right? We can have that same personal feeling that I have with my neighbor with the people in a chat room.
Traditional government institutions take a tremendously long time to fail, and when they do fail, there's usually violence, so we try not to let them fail.
But today, we are in the first time in history that we can actually try out new governance models without the need of people getting killed, because we can try those governance models from the comfort of our sofa.
In the mathematical realm, you cannot treat an algorithm with a gun.
Because it's unstoppable. It's open source code. The cat's out of the bag right away when someone has the idea.
Anything closed source is like saying, I'm a scientist and I've proved something, but I'm not going to show you how I proved it.
It's just free. You download it from the internet, it's open source, you want to enhance it, you do, and if you don't like it, you can just fork it.
And if we have means by which groups can connect to each other to form larger governance structures that govern the entire whole, then we have something that kind of is resembling a fractal structure.
If you think about kind of other examples of superorganisms, you have like beehives and ant colonies, or even just the human body itself is a bunch of cells and microorganisms that are all working together in a single like human body as their environment.
But now what we have proliferating with crypto networks is actually these supranational protocols in which human activity can be governed on this international basis without nation states, without corporations.
So what it allows is for people to come together from wherever, and they can interact together, they can make decisions, they can share in the common enterprise, and then they can all benefit together.
Governance ends up being a really key part of making that work. And if you view blockchains from an evolutionary standpoint, this may be the most critical feature one could imagine.
Any organization of any kind, from your mom and pop shop to your decentralized autonomous organization, can create an entity on Aragon's network and use it for all kinds of things, like their cap table, like payroll, to show where their finances are going, for voting, for upgrades, to the way in which that organization works.
Aragon is a tool that I think will spawn many different early attempts at decentralized governance structures, which, if implemented well, will be powerful.
It's actually two components. So the first one is the Aragon platform to build and govern organizations, societies, and protocols. And the other part is the first digital jurisdiction that has ever existed, the Aragon network.
That doesn't happen very often in the real world. It's rare that you get to set up a new central bank or a new government. So I think we're going to be in sort of this Cambrian explosion of experimentation on both of those fronts.
But with any huge transition that happens in human history, they are very insistent in making us believe that we need them. So the incumbents are trying to use their marketing power, their communication power, their surveillance power to convince people that they still need them. But the market and the people will eventually figure out that they don't. that will be the end of the establishment.
If you want to get our work, there's tons of it on our wiki. Again, please go check it out if you want. With that, I'm pretty much done in terms of what I wanted to present. And there are, oh, where are the stickers? Someone took them already. Over here. They're over here. OK. There are stickers around. Please go find them. But otherwise, I have tons of slides about going into depth about that architecture stack that I showed earlier that I can talk about. But if you don't want to stay for that, or like if you're not interested in that, you don't have to stay. I'd also be interested in taking questions to kind of get like more pointed questions and what you're interested in and what I should keep talking more about. 5?
And we have the lights back on.
Oh.
Thank you.
Two questions. One, do you use Aragon to govern or manage Aragon now? Or?
We do not use it yet. So the mainnet contracts are starting to get deployed. So we have our first audit done, but we're undergoing a second audit just to double check. And so far, we're in the interim report of that, and they haven't found anything, let's say, ground stopping. So we will probably start deploying more contracts to actually govern our own organization pretty soon. The first one that the first one that we have is a survey app, and the survey app is a good use case because nobody can lose money on it. So it doesn't matter if there is a chance that it is slightly broken. But the next one will actually hold funds, and the first one that we're thinking about is an organization or is a payroll app, so that all of the members of Aragon 1 will get paid using a contract.
Yeah, and the second question is also in that kind of direction. Like maybe it would be interesting to hear what kind of processes you guys use to kind of make secure code. Like what do you think is important in a process or organizational sense to get really kind of high quality secure code?
Sure. Do I need to repeat the question, or is it? It's good. Okay. So for secure code, I mean the baseline at the very least is undergoing an audit, and that's like everyone needs to do that. Aside from that, I mean there's a whole bunch of different steps, and we're really interested in kind of what Parity is pushing out for their best practices as well, and working with other people in the space to kind of figure out what the standards should be. For us right now, it's, I mean, a lot of it is human review, right? Audits are also human review, but as well between each other, we make sure that contracts are reviewed between each other. Before we go into audits, we try to do internal reviews to kind of take an entire fresh look at things. And then hopefully we don't change too much code after an audit, but with the dynamic nature of our framework, it necessitates that a little bit, and so we kind of need more and more of that. I mean, we don't use a lot of automated tooling right now other than tests. And tests are good, but tests are really hard to get right, let's say. And 100% code coverage is good, but it's also, like we try to get for that, or we try to go for that, but 100% test coverage is just a signal that maybe there's nothing broken. Or at least you've tested it so that you expect things to work, not that there's any holes. Outside of that, there's a lot of tools like Mithril, like some of the stuff that Trailbits has come out with that are really, really cool, that I'd like to kind of get around to playing with and integrating it into our CI.
What's Mithril?
So Mithril is, what was it called? Is it a symbolic? I think it's a symbolic analyzer. It kind of goes through and looks at all of I don't know if it's all the different code paths, but it kind of takes it down and it's like, okay, this is where the code can go, and oh, there's like there's a pattern here. There's like, it knows certain patterns of how code looks like, the paths that they might go through towards, I think, an instruction, that it says, oh, like, no, maybe there's a problem here. I can't talk too much about it because I'm not really that familiar with it. I just know that like this is a really cool tool that I need to check out and want to use more of.
So we've heard about unstoppable organizations before, and we've seen what happens when they go wrong. It winds up going a layer down the stack, and we have to talk to the full Ethereum network to try and change things.
Mm-hmm.
So what is Aragon's policy when things inevitably go sideways in some sort of project that deploys?
Yeah, at least that is a really good question. Right now we don't have any, let's say, big button to press to pause people's organizations. But that is kind of the thing, one of the things we're working towards in Aragon OS 4.0 in the new version. It's something we have been thinking about but haven't really prioritized yet. So right now it's the same. Like if you put a lot of money in and somehow something is broken, yeah, you have to go down a level to talk and fork or do whatever. But ideally, the ramp-up period is really really long. And it's like, first we have, like, you try it out a little bit, and then as more and more DAOs get created, more and more money gets put into these DAOs. As well, this big red button I'm talking about is going to be likely an opt-in feature where people can say, hey, I'm going to opt into a global panic button that says, in case we detect something really broken or one of our audits come back or someone tells us there's a security vulnerability, we can press this button and stop everybody's finance, like organizations at where they are, and then spin them back up when we have fixes deployed.
So is that a global level for if there's something wrong with Aragon, or is that on a project-by-project basis so you can freeze everything?
It would be, so we're thinking about opt-in globally for both the core organizations and for applications. So if you've installed an application like, let's say, finance that controls payments, and there's something broken with it, but nothing else is broken, hopefully it's to the point where we can say, okay, the finance application should be paused before anybody else does anything bad with it, and let's release a fix and get people to upgrade to that fix.
I have a question. It's regarding documentation. So basically you're saying that you're looking to split the development of Aragon, and for that basically you need like the most awesome documentation known in Earth.
Yeah.
How are you tackling this problem, which is a present problem in the ecosystem, and what would be the best practices to use?
Yeah, I'd say we're not very good at that. As with everybody in this ecosystem, yeah. It's a very difficult problem because as I'll pitch again, we have a developer relations role that is meant to work day to day on making sure the developer experience is really good for people. Now, obviously, we don't have one yet. And so it's kind of been the efforts of everybody to kind of pitch in when they can. And of course, when they can means almost never, unless we have a big event. And so last month, or like 2 weeks ago, ETH Buenos Aires happened. And events like this are really useful, I think, to get some pressure under your butt to say, okay, like people are going to start using our software and we want to get them to use it. So we need to make it really easy for people to use it. And the result of that was hack.aragon.1 and this new CLI. So events like that, I think, do keep us honest in many ways. But as well, it's just a priority problem in many ways. Like a lot of people talk about user experience and then they don't talk about developer experience, especially when everything in the space is geared towards developers right now. So there needs to be maybe more of a spotlight on that and highlighting maybe who has good documentation so other people can follow. I don't know really anybody who has exceptional documentation. I know people who have exceptionally bad documentation, but not exceptionally good documentation. So it's kind of it's like a forever problem for developers. Like, how do we make good documentation? And it's unsolved, intractable.
Makes sense. It's a process.
Yeah, it's a process that hopefully will improve with time. And for us, at least, we're trying to make it more of a priority because, again, we're trying to push for more of these new teams coming out. And we know that the leverage that we get with ourselves is not as high as if we spend the effort ourselves to document very well and make it easy for other people to contribute. And at that point, then we might have lost a little bit of time, but the time that we lost is gained in allowing other people to contribute.
Can you tell more about your deployment process on the blockchain? So how do you update your contracts? How fast can you deploy and stuff like this?
Sure. Fast is easy to answer, just as fast as you can make a transaction and get it mined. Upgradeability, we use the proxy pattern for upgradeability. So very similar, you deploy a base contract and you deploy a proxy contract, link it up with each other. So when you deploy the base contract again, hopefully you put it inside a package manager like the Aragon package manager to say this is where the second version lives. And then you point your new application, or sorry, your proxy to your new application.
Chris Berniski in the video, he says that from mom and pop stores to DAOs could use Aragon. When you develop software, who do you think about? Who's your user group?
I would say the most prominent one is Maria, the one who was at the beginning of the presentation. Someone who is limited, I'd say, by, or potentially limited by what her circumstances may be. Now, in the reality of things, there's a lot of course, this type of software, it's quite open and quite large in terms of audience, or possibly audience. So aside from her, we also focus a lot on thinking the vision of where this might be in 10 years. Like, what are people able to do perhaps in 10 years with the software that we're making? And two is the Aragon Labs projects that I showed earlier, where they're the first ones. They're probably going to be the first really, really serious users outside of us to use the software because they have huge communities as well, and they have a lot of money staked inside their ecosystems, and they're already token native, so there's a little bit less friction to involve them.
Between the Aragon Labs projects and Maria, is it other startups, or where do you see the most useful? Who would benefit the most from your software?
I think that depends on person to person's views. Because for me, like, a lot of what really interested me about Aragon when I first read about it was countries like Venezuela, where there are a lot of broken jurisdictions in the world that are basically trapping people at economic development. And it sucks to see that. And now we have the tools to kind of leapfrog their own governments onto the internet, which is amazing. So I see a lot of value for them. But as well, I think this is an opportunity for us to rethink some things that we've inherited from 300 years ago, 400 years ago, that may as well provide a lot of benefits. But that's more of like experimentation and research and seeing how fast developed countries can kind of get on top of that. But I think, like, in terms of absolute benefits, it's probably people who are trapped in those economic spaces. Yep.
This was a great video, really cool. Just from kind of a business perspective, if you would like to use such an application or the application to actually form a decentralized organization, let's say in a jurisdiction like Germany, or other jurisdictions where you have quite a lot of administrative responsibilities you have to do, you have to pay tax, you have to do this and that. How do you foresee the future from a practical point of view? Do you think you have these virtual organizations where you have a lot of freelancers or individual corporations that act for each person that then does all the administrative stuff manually or by themselves, or do you have kind of outsource that? And then the second question is, if you kind of also looking at the concept of this DICO, if it's pronounced right, where you actually do fundraising and automatically form a decentralized autonomous organization to give investors kind of more safeguards, some safety mechanisms to actually withdraw some money at some point if it doesn't work out like that. You kind of also consider doing such a thing?
For the DICO at least, I mean the specification for the DICO is quite specific, and I mean we can make an app, let's say, to fundraise via DICOs. That's really easy to do on Aragon. We used to have a fundraising app, but it was like there's no point to give a fundraising app because people will decide how they want to fundraise themselves, and it's like an arbitrary options pretty much. So very much you could build one and hook it in to let other people use. We didn't use one obviously at the time because that concept didn't exist. As for the other side, I think it was more like the physical links and the physical jurisdictions and how what your corporate structures might look like in those physical realms today. And that's something that's hard to answer as well. I think there's a lot of legal friction going forward with all of these things. I would hope that it follows perhaps more of the Hollywood model. Maybe that's the most effective model of human collaboration. Hard to tell, but as more and more tools like this emerge, the market will allow more and more people to effectively gain value from that type of model. And I think that's totally fine. That's perfect, because if they're allowed to do that, then, or if they're able to do that now because they have a new tool or because they have new thoughts around it, that's better than it was before, because it's a degree of freedom that they didn't have before, right? And it's perhaps more efficient in the human sense of happiness or like producing content. Yeah, I can't really answer much about like in terms of places like Germany, because I think it'll be really hard for countries like Germany to kind of step on board this as an entirety, because it's like those are the jurisdictions that are not meant right now for with the type of bureaucracy that Germany has. It's not meant for this type of project in the first place, I think. There needs to be slightly looser rules to let people experiment and to figure out what works for them. I don't know if that answered your question, because I think there was a few thoughts around it.
Then can you elaborate a little bit more? How could it work in a country like my country, Venezuela, that you mentioned already?
Mm-hmm. I mean, Venezuela is kind of a tough one, because I think the easiest path for Venezuela is just for the government to collapse, and for it, hopefully, for the people to self-organize themselves somehow into a more structured, like a better structured governance system for themselves.
Yeah, but that's what we see from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
But in the inside, there are many people that actually support this kind of government.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is how Aragon could change the way that people do stuff in Venezuela if they actually support this kind of stuff that is happening there.
I mean, I guess it's like more towards the traditional legal route of like reforming change inside a government to accept, like the first thing that has to happen is for a government to legally recognize a DAO as something that like exists, and that is that either can be taxed or can have bank accounts and things like that. I don't know if I think Venezuela in that sense is going to be really hard, but who knows? Maybe one day they'll do that with the petro coin somehow. I don't know. But I mean, that's what I'm talking about in terms of lax regulations. Like people need to be a little bit more progressive, or governments, it's probably best in governments that are a little bit more progressive to say, like in Switzerland, where it's like, okay, what does it mean for this entity to exist on the internet? Can we legally recognize them as entities that exist with a Swiss counterpart? And what does that interchange look like? So I think, I mean, I can't really answer too much about the legal aspects there.
With your survey app, do you already get a feeling what your voters' participation is? Like what's...
Yeah, so right now it's very low because one, it's just been released, and two, you can't vote yet with a hardware wallet. because we just hook into MetaMask right now. And we're trying to build support to kind of generate, like, for now, probably the best solution is to show people like a transaction that they can generate and send on my crypto or something. But like we imagine most people who have ANT do not hold most of it on like MetaMask. So it's just very difficult for them to even vote. Hopefully, yeah.
But what do you think, like in the future? Because it would be really interesting to see what the voters' participation in the network that is built for exactly that would be. And if it's only like 10%, you know, it's all harmless, right? Then,
I'm very scared about the participation rate, let's say. Again, it's kind of a first step, and I think right now there's no consequences as well, and it costs money to vote in the survey too. It costs a little bit of ether, and so there's a high degree of friction towards someone actually voting, and they have no idea whether or not it's going to matter, especially if they have like 0.00001% of the total network stake. It's like, why would I really care if someone who has 1% can just vote and disproportionately change everything? So there's certainly some things there that like we don't imagine a lot of people, I think, participating right away. But at the very least, it allows us to get an insight. Like, for example, if things are going really badly one way, then that's a chance for us to bring it up and say, hey, you know, is this actually what the community thinks in a more like human-to-human approach versus on a contract level?
I think that a lot what you alluded to also in the video maybe is that a big kind of target user area, people that are underprivileged maybe as well, that don't have access to traditional banking services, stuff like that, that probably cannot vote because they don't have a passport or something like that. How do you overcome the problem? Because right now I can only participate if I have access to a banking service, can be registered on an exchange with my passport, right? Do you have any strategies like partnering up with, I don't know, Visa or something like that?
But that's not true. You can also work as a kind of mine tokens to get tokens. You don't have to go via bank account through traditional fiat system.
Yeah, but you need
money
also
yeah.
to get that mining rate.
Significant resources.
That's impossible.
Of course.
So I mean, do you have like any plans for that, or is that too far ahead?
I think that's a infrastructure level problem that maybe it's like the what's it called, the what's that classic game theory problem that I'm forgetting. It's just like the incentives are so low that nobody are working on it, and like they're working on different things. Because like it's the same for any project inside a cryptocurrency, let's say, that there's inherent friction towards obtaining that outside of having significant resources to buy rigs, or maybe through, I mean, the best approach right now is maybe through a local portal like local Ethereum. If you just have like $10 and want to trade that to someone.
I would really hope that you don't want to stay with the work, right?
Well, I mean, we're backed on Ethereum, so Ethereum, whatever Ethereum does.
So you're running on the Ethereum mainnet? Sorry,
we are,
I don't know anything about Aragon.
Yeah.
I thought that you had your own.
No, yeah. So we run on Ethereum, and so whatever Ethereum does, I guess we're kind of trapped.
Okay.
Outside of porting our contracts to a different fork or etc.
Do you have your own plan for changing that? Because being dependent, like, I mean, this seems like a huge project, right? And you don't really want to be closer with all the other people doing CryptoKitties on Ethereum. Obviously, this is the standard thing that is said at a meetup, but in general, this seems to be far too big a project to be able to scale it quickly with Ethereum. Do you want to be completely dependent on Ethereum?
I would say, so I think very similar to what Loom was talking about. If anybody has read their blog post before, we chose Ethereum because it is the best solution right now, and there's no point in terms of us re-implementing some of what they're doing. The best that we can do right now is incentivize people to work on projects that further that scalability challenge. So for example, our grants program, we gave, I think it was $100,000 or $150,000 to a sharding implementation to help them get funded and to get them keep working on what they want to work on rather than something else. And then again, of course, just kind of keeping our heads up and seeing what other tools people are using, what other interim solutions there are for that scaling problem.
Have you thought about, we're actually building stuff in Ethereum as well, but private implementation, so we don't have all these problems. And also like B2B, so it's a bit boring, I guess. But have you thought about any new network structures that aren't completely decentralized, where, I mean, you talk about constitution and all of that, where basically you use, I don't know, get, click, proof of authority, whatever. So you don't have these problems, or you don't?
Yeah, I mean, in the interim, we might have to do something like that if we're finding a lot of people are using Aragon and they're inherently limited by what the network can provide. For example, I was talking about earlier, voting costs money and it requires a transaction, it requires it to be mined. So the friction is very high for someone to vote. And at the end of the day, that's not we have problems already in society with voting, and that just makes it even worse. So there are definitely some interim solutions where we're using bridge networks and things like that to scale transactions outside of the mainnet. We haven't done that yet, but for example, Giveth and I think a few others are working with Parity to provide their own basically POA sidechain, so that like until something needs to go back to the mainnet, they use that sidechain. But that's not very useful right now because they can only send balances. It can only send like Ether transactions, and until it becomes generalized where you can send any type of message and hold state, it's going to be very limited in terms of its use case. Cool. I think that's.
How much does it cost to launch a
DAO? A DAO, yeah. So right now, so on Rinkeby it costs quite a lot because we don't have all of the stuff for mainnet yet. To launch an organization on Rinkeby costs about 6.1 million gas. So that's quite a lot. That's like on the order, depending on where it's at. Like I think it's around $10 to launch an organization. It's cheap by bureaucratic standards, but expensive by normal standards, let's say, or like the goal. It's funny actually because when we launched our Rinkeby at the end of March, the gas limit was at like 6.9 million, and then 2 weeks later it's up to like 7.5 because of all the I think we were filling up entire blocks as people were playing with their test version. So it's definitely not cheap, let's say, and it's going to run into problems, but that's kind of the second level of making things more efficient and making those making the implementation a little bit yeah.
And how can we make it accessible then for Venezuelans where they make $1 per month or $2 per month? I see it very difficult, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's kind of an inherent problem with this, is that to do something you have to provide money, and of course a global unit of account means that some people are going to be on the lower scale of things. Eventually, of course, as I was saying, we want things to be really, really cheap. And so, I mean, we're thinking about a few strategies to make that deployment easier, on the order of hopefully a couple tens of cents. But there's a few tricks that we can kind of do to get that happening. But I mean, if someone is making $1 a month and Ether prices are like at $1,000 a month, there's not much we can really do aside from having our own sidechain, which may or may not happen. It's difficult right now to say like what that might look like going forward, because that's like a level of complexity that's higher than where we are now and all of the other scaling solutions.
Main question. So have you considered using something other than the web frontend, or maybe at least using a way where the Aragon app and the actual like app running inside of it don't actually share any context whatsoever? Because like I don't know anything about how you did your sandboxing and kudos for doing it, but I'm usually worried about any systems where you can actually share memory between like two different like levels of security, and the only like really way to be really sure that there is nothing can go wrong is to have just to to have sending messages as the only means of communication.
Yeah.
So like, have you considered? I know if you like do your own Electron app where you have just two separate like JavaScript engines running parallel and they just communicate by messages, something like that.
Yeah, that's basically what we're doing with the sandboxes. So we have so the UI is presented in an iframe, and the messages are all going through postmessage, the postmessage API.
Yeah, but it's still the same. Like, it's still the same JavaScript context.
They're two different contexts.
Yeah, but
the iframe.
It's the same browser.
Yes.
Yeah. So like to be really secure, you would need like on the OS level have two different processes that can communicate by messages.
Yeah.
So and you can kind of do that if you have like it might be a bit more tricky because you kind of maybe have to like build like an Electron app or something like that to like do it properly. But like, have you considered doing something like really like pedantic for like splitting the UI, the Aragon UI from the app UI?
Yeah, I'm not sure if Electron lets you do that too, because I think it's all inside that same context as well.
You need like two Electron apps.
Yeah, you would have to like, well, you'd have to build like an Electron clone inside Electron to. So no, we haven't really. I mean, that's something that would be really nice, but that's something that we don't have resources for. Like, it's building something like that. I can imagine as well the complexity level is a lot higher. To just kind of talking with the browser using that similar context. I mean, I guess eventually if there's enough stake and depending on how well audits go for our front end, maybe that's the only safe approach. But I think for now it's like the path of least resistance is assuming that the current web sandboxes that we have are adequate enough for people. But yeah, that doesn't really solve the underlying scalability issue unless there's like some way to commit state. You could do a whole bunch of things and then like some way to to send that state over to the chain in one transaction or on it. Cool. Yeah. Sure.
Cool.
Sounds good.